Welcome to Two Way Tonight. I'm Mark Halperin. Our guest tonight, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is not here. We don't have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a guest, but we got a lot of video of Robert F. Kennedy that we'll play for you. We'll also play you extensive sound bites from President Trump, who talked up a blue streak at the White House, but there was one question he wouldn't answer. That's what we call a deep tease in the television business. And I'll tell you what the question was. He wouldn't answer questions about what may be the biggest story of the day, and I'll explain why in a moment, which is the White House kind of walking back the spending freeze on grants and other government spending, domestic discretionary programs. It's a little confusing, and I'll show you why in a second. But what makes it maybe doubly confusing is that normally he'll talk about anything president, as you'll see, would not talk about this issue. Our guests tonight, who've just joined us, so they get to listen to me drone on a bit. Matt Gorman, a Republican, Brian Wolf, a Democrat, two very, very smart guys. If you sat next to either one of them on an airplane and just started gabbing with them, you'd text to your relatives on arrival, I just sat next to a really smart person. So they're really smart, and they'll be part of the conversation after I run through tonight's top stories. And then, of course, we want your participation. If you're here on the two-way platform, please raise your hand. If you've never asked a question before, regardless of your political affiliation, please raise your hand tonight and get in on the conversation. It's only Wednesday, but we've already had new people on both shows throughout the week, but we'd like more. So some people come on for the first time because I say something that provokes them. So maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll figure out something to say to provoke people to raise their hand because we'd like more of you to raise your hands. Um, so, uh, where to begin? As I said, the two big stories of the day were the Kennedy hearing and President Trump. Let me start with Kennedy. I think the coverage is a little misleading because as always, a lot of the media covers a hearing like that as theater criticism, right? Drama, the fighting, and there were fiery moments between RFKJ and Elizabeth Warren, Michael Bennet, Bernie Sanders, and some other of the Democratic senators. And so the press treats that as Kennedy under fire. And there's no doubt that in some of those moments, eye of the beholder, you could say the Democrats got the best of Kennedy or Kennedy got the best of them. We'll play some of those and you can make up your own mind. But it's not really the issue. He's not going to be confirmed. It's clear to me, based on my reporting in the hearing, he's not going to be confirmed on the back of Democrats. He's not going to lose 7 Republicans and make it up with Democratic votes. He might get some Democratic votes, but I don't think he's going to be confirmed unless he gets to 50 Republicans. And he may well. Some of the coverage rightly points out that his command of the facts on some issues, particularly related to the biggest part of HHS in terms of dollars, Medicare and Medicaid, like many public officials, sometimes he mixed up the programs. Okay. There's really no reason to mix them up. They both start with med, but they're different programs. And under questioning from Bill Cassidy, who we said this morning on the show is really the key in some ways to whether Kennedy's going to be confirmed, who's a doctor and very knowledgeable about the medical entitlement programs. Under that questioning, some of Kennedy's answers were not great. You could certainly take a literal read of what he said and say, that guy does not know his stuff. On the other hand, he was extremely well prepared. Clearly, they did a lot of practicing on the questions that would be expected. Some from Democrats, some from Republicans. A lot about his past statements on issues like abortion, on issues like vaccines, on issues connected to industries, the role of industries in health. No Republican senator, to my knowledge, has come out against him, but nor have 50 Republican senators come out for him. Some of the members of the committee were quite supportive, including the chair. Many of them ended their questioning by saying they look forward to working with him, sending the implicit message that they believe he will be confirmed. I think it's safe to say, based on everything I know, and we'll listen to some sound in a bit with our guests, that he's more likely to be confirmed now than he was at 10 o'clock when the hearing started. Because although, again, no Democratic support on the committee at least seems there, the Republican questions were largely, not entirely, but largely questions of people who are going to vote yes. Now, the Wall Street Journal today reported in a story that I thought would get more attention than it did, that the White House had to turn Thom Tillis around to get Hegseth confirmed. that there were three solid votes against him, McConnell and Collins and Murkowski, and that Tillis basically was planning to vote no, and they turned him through a strong effort. Some are claiming now that the same three no votes will be there on Kennedy, but that the White House has the other 50 Republican senators in hand. It would require J.D. Vance to break another tie. We'll see. And again, even though he's not going to get lots of Democratic votes, I can't rule out that he gets two Democratic votes that replace, let's say, if he gets four Republicans against him. That could happen. And there's no doubt, you heard even from the Democrats who were the most hostile to him overall, no one can be against Make America Healthy Again. Nobody, it'd be ridiculous to be opposed to making food safety for kids, doing whatever we need to do to limit the apparent spread of chronic diseases for kids. So that's the narrative he wants. And there's no doubt that Republicans like that, and it seems like Republicans are accepting his explanations on things like abortion, where his kind of go-to line was, every abortion is a tragedy, right? The pro-life community can get on board with that. Even if the honest next statement was, and at least in the past, I've been extremely pro-choice, you can be pro-choice and think every abortion is a tragedy. All right. That's the Kennedy hearing. At the White House, again, another federal judge, this one an Obama appointee from Rhode Island, said again that the pause in federal grants and spending that has discombobulated a lot of people in the country was going to be stayed. The suspension was going to be suspended. In the meantime, the White House said, we're suspending the suspension ourselves in light of the rulings. But then the White House press secretary confused everything by saying, we suspended the OMB order. We didn't suspend the executive order. Okay, put up the White House email. So just a couple minutes before we came on the air together, the White House sent around an email. They do this daily blast, at least semi-daily so far, where they basically go to their bread and butter, which is talking about fake news, and so and hoax, right? So the hoax is perpetuated against President Trump and his administration never stop, and today was no exception. So hoax, a score of fake news outlets, including blah, 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 and many others claim President Trump's directive to temporarily pause certain federal spending was, quote, rescinded. Fact, no such thing took place. Instead, a memo from the Office of Management and Budget was rescinded in an effort to alleviate confusion. Okay? So there's no doubt that even if the White House had a secret plan to do it the way they did it, and they gamed out all the panic it would cause, even if that's the case, and it seems like it's not, they certainly didn't do a good job on the front end of making it absolutely clear that individual beneficiaries, recipients of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, would not be affected. They did a bad job on that, even if they were purposely trying to discombobulate everybody else. It seems like this was amongst the big mistakes they've made so far. It certainly has invigorated Democrats, and a lot of my Democratic sources have reached out to say, oh, you've been talking about, they're amazing, they're so great, greatest administration ever, totally on a roll, this will continue for weeks and months. I'm not sure this is going to do damage for them with the public. I'm not sure it's going to do much damage with them with Republican members of Congress, although they're not happy because their offices are besieged with calls. But it's going to be interesting to see how they go from here. They flood the zone, and then this thing, and again, it's just a reality. The press is looking to change the narrative from grudging respect for how well they were launching to this is a clown show, and this certainly opens the door to doing that. Okay, again, I'm going to play a sound from the Kennedy hearing. I'm going to play a sound from President Trump on these topics and more with our guests in a moment. Few more things. President said today that they're going to put tens of thousands of illegal immigrants in Gitmo. Gitmo has a massive capacity. They've famously been a dozen or two of 9/11 connected alleged terrorists there, and they've been there forever because they didn't want to send them home. They didn't want to try them in the United States. They've been there. But if you don't know this, Gitmo is massive. Gitmo is like bigger than a Vegas hotel. A lot of beds in Gitmo, so they're going to put a lot of people there. Lee Zeldin confirmed as head of the EPA. Bob Menendez sentenced to 11 years in prison today for the convictions he had related to taking gold bars and everything else. Interesting New York Times story says there's talk in the Justice Department of ending the Southern District's prosecution of Mayor Adams. Now, if you read the story carefully, it says, maybe not, maybe it won't happen. These are just conversations, but huge implications for whether Mayor Adams has any chance at all to be reelected. There are those who say if he got pardoned by Donald Trump preemptively, it would be hard to run for a reelection in New York City because of the association with Donald Trump. But a quiet dropping of the current case and not bringing the additional cases that everyone has assumed is coming and the prosecutors have said are coming, that maybe would allow him to run for reelection. So watch that closely. All right. As I said, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll get to you all shortly. Now, let's bring in our guest for the night. Excuse me. Matt Gorman, dog owner, Republican strategist, man of many, many, many looks. Got a face like Jim Carrey in terms of its expressions. And Brian Wolf. Brian Wolf, if you don't know Brian Wolf, as I said, he's a genius, very knowledgeable about all things. Brian, I believe you're an Arkansan, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you do that suey pig thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely not. And Brian worked with lots of the leading Democratic figures of the 20th and 21st century, including Nancy Pelosi for many years. And we're delighted to have you both here. Gentlemen, I want to play sound for you and basically just let you react to it. And we'll start with the Kennedy hearings. And I want to start with something from his opening statement, which was clearly meant to be the narrative framing that Team Kennedy wanted the senators and the public to take away. So I'll play it for you, ask you what you think. Folks, please play number 5.
Problems in this country that we must face honestly. And the first thing I've done every morning for the past 20 years is to get on my knees and pray to God that he would put me in a position to end the chronic disease epidemic and to help America's children. That's why I'm so grateful to President Trump for the opportunity to sit before you today and seek your support and partnership in this endeavor.
Brian, independent of everything else that went on in the hearing, is that, do you think, an appealing, winning way to talk about wanting this job?
Well, I think it's an appealing way to sort of write what President Trump had previously said about Kennedy. As you know, during the campaign, he had plenty to say about Robert Kennedy and exactly what he stood for. And, I think there's no mistaking in this hearing that there was an opportunity there for Democrats to really paint exactly the difference between Kennedy's previous views and his current views in order to get confirmed. And, I think that 80 million Americans are on Medicare and Medicaid out of 334 million Americans. And, that is a lot to consider when you're talking about a program. And it's a lot to consider when we're talking about, whether it be vaccinations, when he talked about the COVID-19 vaccinations, and what he really referred to those and claimed them as genetically engineered. I think that Senator Bennett, who's been a slightly, to me, Mark, sleepy senator in his service in Congress, really came alive and really pointed out, what he talked about with regards to black and white people being spared, but Jews and Chinese people, and what that looked like. I think that plus, everything he said about Lyme disease, pesticides, Western aids versus, what we see with regards to Western aids is concerned. And I just think there was a lot to really take on there. And I do agree with you that I think Republicans were really trying to right size him during the hearing, as they normally would. But I think there's a lot of question there, and I think that there's going to be, I think there's a lot of confusion about his record that was brought up. But I think we also have to look at the fact that I think there's a history here, Mark, and you know it very well personally, that there's a history in these hearings of confirming the president's picks for his cabinet, and that have typically been, I, I hate to say it, but disrespected. So it really almost like these, as you say, are a little bit of the exercise we're going through, but they're perfunctory when you consider that what the overall outcome will be. So I'm going to side with you on. I think that everyone aligns with doing what the president wants to do, and the president changed his mind about Kennedy in order to have the expediency of being elected and getting Kennedy on his side, and he certainly did that. I think that shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah. Matt, the Hegseth people had a very clear strategy to say this guy is going to be a warrior to change the Pentagon, and you should just focus on that. The Kennedy people obviously want the focus to be on Matt Maha and protecting kids. How do you think they did in that soundbite and overall in framing the way they wanted it framed?
That was a very similar point to what I was going to make. I think you're exactly right. They went in and they did polling, message testing, whatever, and they said, look, you hit processed foods, you hit Maha, you hit school lunches and eating healthier, getting all that stuff. That's a winner. Talk about vaccines. You got to pivot from your past statements and talk about your pro-vaccine now. Relitigating past statements is not the way to get confirmed. Maha's popular. The anti-vax stuff isn't as popular, certainly. I think that is the key here. And it seemed like if you look at the opening statement, talking a lot about that. I think they did a good job. I think, look, I think your point also at the top was right? When you get into these things, Supreme Court hearings, confirmation hearings to a certain extent, one side's going to yell and they're going to go and pound you. You had, Bernie Sanders yelling about onesies, Elizabeth Warren, which got a lot of traction on conservative Twitter, talking about, whatever she was talking about. I don't really know. And look, you got to let them be the party of the higher ed school administrator to an extent. You just got to sit there, take it, and play prevent defense. And that's what I think Kennedy did. And the strategy was sound. Now, seems like also Democrats had a tactic. It wasn't just vaccines. It was Medicare, Medicaid, right? You've heard this a little bit here and there, talking about entitlements. Bubbles up every once in a while. They clearly got some polling back that they feel is impactful on that. I would have been interested if they had gone more in that direction and really gone after him on that. I'm curious if there's I think there's a second day of hearings in the finance committee.
Yeah, the other committee. Yeah.
Yeah. Be curious if they go through that. And I'd be right now, if I'm Team Kennedy, tonight they're reviewing the performance with him. I'd be drilling down a little bit on Medicare, Medicaid, getting his answers a little bit more sound on that.
Yeah.
For day two.
Yeah, it certainly was his weakest. And again, Senator Cassidy was not. I mean, it was kind of like possum questions. He wasn't grilling him, but he was throwing up questions that you should know. And I was surprised at his weak answers there, but I don't think it's going to kill him. Let's just look at the Elizabeth Warren thing again. I don't know that this questioning matters, but my question, Brian, to you coming out of it is, if Elizabeth Warren asked you if you were her staff person, and afterwards she said, Brian, did I achieve what we wanted to achieve? You tell me what she achieved with this. Please play number the Warren one. Where is it?
Take money from drug companies in any way, shape, or form.
Me?
Yes, you.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to commit to that.
Okay, good. That's what I figured. I said it's an easy question to start with. And I think you're right on this question.
I don't think any of them want to give me money, by the way.
All right, is that all we have? All right, I thought it went on from there. Anyway, She basically was trying to get him to take a pledge that even after he left office, he wouldn't take money from the drug companies and that he wouldn't take money from plaintiffs who sued the drug companies. His current arrangement, she said, I think she's right from what I know, with his law firm has been every person he brings as a client, he gets some money. And if they win a case, he gets 10% of the damages. She said, stop profiting off of that. Still do the cases basically, but stop profiting off it. I don't know that he's hard of hearing, but it seems like he might be. He certainly had a
There's
hard
more
time
fighting in number
with,
4.
okay, in number 4. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I thought that was number 4. Play number 4. I thought that was number 4. Shows you what I know.
That was 4.
Yeah, that was 4. We just don't, it just got cut. It's fine. Brian, hectoring him about stuff like that. I say hectoring. Maybe that's too loaded a word. Asking him about that is what purpose does that serve or no purpose?
Look, I really don't think it serves very much of a purpose that's impactful. I just don't. We're in a situation right now where we are in the position as Democrats of, normalizing a lot of this behavior. And that is actually what you're seeing across the board is it doesn't matter what they've done. It's probably better that the Secretary of Defense went before this hearing. By the way, if I had aligned anything with regards to Senate hearings with the majority of Republicans, I would have said, let's do it in this order for this reason, because this does not matter, by the way, what Elizabeth Warren, of all people, thinks about this particular subject. And I'm just saying that as a Democrat.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that, the yelling and the screaming and the everything else, we've just, there has to be an answer to the normalizing of, things that people consider, not ethical. And I'm sorry, but we're just not, as Democrats, we're not doing a good job of that.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's effective. And it wasn't effective here. In fact, it was one of the weakest part of the hearings, in my view. There were many other points that other senators carried forward that were much more weighty than that particular segment.
Well said. We'll talk more about Kennedy in a bit, but I want to switch to President Trump and his public statements today. Talked about a bunch of stuff. I want to first raise this issue. Clearly, cuts in programs or even threatened cuts in programs can really alarm people. But one thing I know the Trump people are delighted about is to have a fight about should we have fewer federal employees. There was 2 polls out in the last 24 hours that show cutting the federal workforce is popular. But the Democrats, led by the representatives like Tim Kaine, who represent Maryland and Virginia in particular, they feel obligated to go out and defend federal workers. Here's Donald Trump, number 8, please, talking about federal employees being fired if they won't come to the office.
As everyone knows, most of the time they're not working, they're not very productive, and it's unfair to the millions of people in the United States who are in fact working hard from job sites and not from their home. As federal employees, they must meet a high standard. They're representing our government, they're representing our country. If they don't agree by February 6th to show up back to work in their office, they will be terminated, and we will therefore be downscaling our government, which is something that the last 10 presidents have tried very hard to do but failed.
Matt Gorman, I don't need any polling data to say you don't want to be the party defending federal workers. And I grew up in Washington area. I have nothing against them, but how does a party leadership stop the rank and file from thinking let's have this fight? These are people with families. They're people who do good work. They're public servants. How do you stop them from being tricked into the exact fight the White House wants to have? Pretend you're a Democrat hat.
I think that's a very good point. I think you have to go up the particulars, which is you've seen Tim Kaine do, right? A little bit. He's saying, well, they don't have the money to pay out these buyouts, right? They're trying to go off the particulars of it because, right, on its face, if you're not going to show up to work, you get fired. You're like a lot of us, right? Here, or the rest of the country.
But more profoundly than that, people think there are too many government employees.
Yes.
They think the government's too big.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in a way, right, the Trump administration has been approaching this fairly cleverly. They've been doing, in a way, a form of bureaucrat self-deportation where you can have your job, but you got to do X, Y, and Z. And if you're not willing to come into the office, seems pretty basic, and a couple other things, then there's not a spot for you. And I think that is a clever way as opposed to just going taking a meat cleaver to all this point blank. It's a smart way to do it.
Brian, did you ever listen to Hugh Hewitt? You ever listen to his show?
Oh yeah.
All right, so Hugh Hewitt has this like list of questions that he asks all his guests, like was Alger Hiss a spy, or do we need to build more ships? Here's my question, particularly for Democrats: do you think federal employees should be in the office 5 days a week?
Absolutely. I mean,
Absolutely. All right.
this sort of period of that we've been through, we're through it. I think Donald Trump did the right thing and set the right tone. I agree with him 100%, which is, it's time for us to get back to work.
Right.
And
So, Brian, what's wrong with your party where you've got all these members of Congress defending, saying, "Oh, don't fire government employees who won't come. Let them work 2 days a week." What's wrong with them?
you know what, Mark? The last time the Democratic Party really started to win over voters, and I'm going to go back for you here so you remember this, in 2006, when Rahm Emanuel was head of the DCCC and Democrats in both House and Senate, okay, started running against the current type of government that we had. They were anti-government last time, by the way.
Yeah.
And hasn't been a mandate since on the Democratic side. So I just say look at that because that is something to think about when we think about the federal workforce or anything like that. And I think the president has hit a nerve out there that if the rest of America is out there struggling, by the way, with regards to employment and working and, day to day, do they think the federal workforce should be working from home? I don't think so.
All right. I want to show you two pieces of sound from the president today, and then ask you both to weigh in on this issue of what's going on with the suspending of the spending and the suspending of the suspension of the spending, and then the clarification that they're not really suspending the suspension of the spending. So please play number 7, followed by number 10.
Announced in 2015, and we won in 2016. We did very well in 2020, but we did really well just recently. And I'm restating right now to correct any confusion that the media has purposely and somehow, for whatever reason, created Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid have not been affected by any action we're taking in any way, shape, or form. We are merely looking at parts of the big bureaucracy where there has been tremendous waste and fraud and abuse. In that process, we identified and stopped $50 million being sent to Gaza to buy condoms for Hamas. 50 million. And you know what's happened to them? They've used them as a method of making bombs. How about that? We stopped an attempt to make an illicit payment for illegal alien resettlement. We canceled $181 million in DEI training contracts. This is just for the training of people in DEI, which has been terminated and completely terminated. And we paused $1.7 billion in unauthorized payments to foreign organizations, including stopping more than $40 million that was on its way out the door to the very corrupt World Health Organization, which has not done its job and not done it properly. We also...
All right, go to number 10, please.
President, government funding. Can you take a quick question on government funding to pause?
I don't think this is appropriate time, really. I respect that, but I don't think it's I can just tell you, government is doing very well, and we're cutting way back, but this is not the appropriate time. Thank you.
So that was at the Lakin Riley signing ceremony. I'm not sure applause is appropriate either. But Brian, what do you think of this? I'll use one of my favorite words. What do you think of this kerfuffle over the suspension and they're kind of pulling it back, but not? What do you think is actually going on and what impact do you think it might have over the debate going forward?
Well, I'm going to give a little hope with regards to Democrats right now. I think what happened over the last 36 hours with regards to the move to rescind that, of course, they want to be able to do, Mark. You know, previously, you've always been a master at spin, and you have to think about it that way because they really needed to come out and spin that in a different way because it didn't land well. It didn't land well with the majority of Americans that depend on the federal government for funding, for grants, for you name it, and especially in the short term funding of those issues, that those might be cut off and the support might go away. And by the way, some of that very demographic, Mark, voted for President Trump.
Right.
Okay. And they heard that. So I will say the Democratic Party is not dead. Okay. No matter the autopsy that people want to give it, it's not dead. I will say that they did a good job in coalescing right now around, the issues, the points that mattered on this issue and drove it home. So I will say there's some hope there, but there's been very little over the last 2 months, as you know, and that was one that we could see where the overreach matched, what was really going on, and it changed the outcome.
Yep.
And there's more of that probably waiting in the wings, but I don't think it lives in the confirmation hearings of cabinet picks. I don't think that's where it lives.
Yep. Matt Gorman, what do you make of this back and forth and confusion? Is it something they're kind of trying to do damage control over? Is there a method here? What do you think's going on?
Yeah, I mean, look, it stands in such stark contrast to what the last 10 days have been, right? You've seen executive orders are very precise and targeted, and they knew exactly what they were doing. This was very, very vague, right? And that vagary let Democrats go on offense on this a little bit and play in that opacity. Look, I will say this too, like though, Democrats were not going to be dead forever. I say that, look, this was a pretty muted reaction if this was a comeback, right? Like, so to speak. I wouldn't get too over my skis and, oh my God, Democrats are back as a narrative. I think, remember when really the first time Democrats felt they had momentum in 2017, I would say was the Muslim ban where you had people at airports, and it was just a very different time. They have something they can talk about proactively, right? I think in a lot of respects, they were really hoping, and they are hoping that the immigration rate, something goes haywire. And so they were trying to seize, no pun intended, on every little thing that happened with this. They weren't getting traction. This is at least something they could talk about. But even that, it's not as galvanizing, I think, as hoped.
Yep. Please raise your hand if you want to get in the conversation. We'll do a couple more things and then want to bring folks in to ask questions. Two stories that are percolating now, I'll just mention. Sullivan and Cromwell is taking over the Trump felony appeal in New York. Why is that significant? Because those kind of law firms, that is as white a shoe a firm as you get, they would not have taken on Trump cases pre-election because partners would quit. If partners wanted to take the case, they'd have to be asked to leave the firm. Now it's safe to represent the president. And so that's symbolically part of what we've seen. And along the same lines, Mark Zuckerberg, Wall Street Journal has a story about Facebook settling a case with Donald Trump from past conflicts that they've had. And that story has some reporting in it regarding communication between Donald Trump and Zuckerberg that, again, suggests Zuckerberg's bending the knee is not happening completely organically. I'll leave it at that. Read the story. Pete Hegseth did his first interview since becoming Secretary of Defense today, and he did it with his friend and former co-host, Will Cain, who, like Hegseth, has left the curvy couch on weekends and is now in the Cavuto slot at 4 p.m. Eastern time on Fox News Channel, gave him a 10-minute interview, at the end of which Will Cain said, I still get the first interview. This doesn't count because it was only 10 minutes. So that's a home court advantage. But I want to play you, number 16, one soundbite from the interview just to get a sense of how Pete Hegseth, fully installed in the office now, seems to be feeling his oats. This is Pete Hegseth talking about General Milley and the efforts he is making on behalf of President Trump to get back some of what they feel they lost, being unhappy with Milley's conduct as chairman of the Chiefs. 16, please.
I want to ask you about General Mark Milley. His photo, his portrait was taken down at the Pentagon. He has, I think there's currently a commission being put together to explore whether or not he should be demoted. His security clearances have been taken away. Tell me the thought process, both there at the Pentagon, at the White House, with Mark Milley.
Accountability is back, Will. It's the understanding that if you actively undermined the chain of command, as General Milley did under the previous Trump administration, we are going to review those actions administratively inside the Defense Department. Mark Milley got a pardon. That's something President Biden was in his purview to do. Just like in our purview at the Defense Department, we have the opportunity to review things he may have done inside the chain of command while President Trump was president that undermined those authorities. So security clearance in the interim is revoked. There will be a review of the rank he will retain upon retirement, and he'll have that process. But this is a demonstration that inside President Trump's Defense Department, we're going to hold not just junior levels or the highest levels possible accountable for actions, and that's what the signal this is meant to send.
Well, I know
Brian, I put myself in the mind of some Democrats, and I think a lot of Democrats will find what the Secretary of Defense said there to be chilling in more ways than one. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely going to see a lot more of that, by the way. This is a clip of a movie that you ended up showing that I bet you, Mark, we're going to see over and over and over again. And I would say with what the Secretary of Defense said, it is going to be based on what their view is on accountability. I would say, on the opposite side of that, it's going to be clear retribution. There's absolutely no way this backfires on them unless, for instance, something happens with revoking their security clearance, for example, and their security detail, and then something happens to one of them. That's all it takes, by the way, is one of them will change the conversation, because something like that will change the dynamic of this entire situation. And I'm talking about Fauci. I'm talking about the rest of them too.
Yep.
All it has to do is happen one time.
Yep. Matt Gorman, if the president or Susie Wiles called you and said, we're thinking of doing this stuff against Milley, is it good? A, is it good politics? And B, is it the right thing to do? What would your answer to those questions be?
I think two things. Number one, his first answer on this a couple days ago, I think was pretty good. And what it was this. It was, look, talking about security, government doesn't pay for the security permanently. And you got to make that case. Only one group of people gets lifetime Secret Service protection.
Yeah.
Former presidents, right? Even VPs only get 6 months. You got to make that case, and you got to talk about that. Rip the Band-Aid off. That's number one. And I think what you have is your aides on background say, look, Milley's a political animal. You don't get to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs without being one, and that's fine. He was visible. He leaked. He had all these memos. He leaked to Peter Baker and Susan Glasser and all this other stuff, which is fine. But you know what? When you're a political animal, you got to live and die by all of that. And so if he made a bet, and if Biden had won, he'd be getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He'd be, I bet maybe even bandied about as a Secretary of Defense. Maybe. He lost. And so I wouldn't call it retribution, but just like a lot of these appointees come out on the wrong end of this sort of thing, you make that case, which is a little bit more process-based.
Is it morally right what they're doing with Milley?
In terms of what? In terms of the detail and classification?
Classification, investigating to strip him of his rank, removing his pictures from the walls, removing his security detail, and basically making his life miserable. Is that the morally right thing to do?
Here's what I would say on that. I don't know about the picture stuff. That's whatever. Clearance, there's way too many people having security clearance when they no longer need it. I think that's a government-wide problem, and that's totally okay. Same with overclassification documents. That's number one. Security detail, these people should I have no problem with it. You need to pay
Yeah.
for yourself, like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney do. That's
Yeah.
fine. Pay for yourself. And the retribution stuff I would spin. But yeah, I think he has to make a better case about it.
All right. I'm going to move on. All right. Raise your hand if you want to get in. We're going to first bring in our favorite Tennessee doctor, Dr. John's coming in. Doctor, I want to ask you about Bobby Kennedy, and then you say whatever you want, but I just tee you up. On the one hand, he emphasized the stuff that's really been inspirational. We've talked about it before. Tens of millions of Americans want their kids to be free of tainted food, tainted drugs, etc. On the other hand, his knowledge of Medicare and Medicaid was lower than the doctors and nurses you work with in your hospital. So, what did you
You want
think
to
of
see
how he
my,
did?
here's my notes
Yeah.
that I took
Okay.
from
Start reading.
watching. I won't go over all of them.
Tell us what you thought overall, particularly on the second point, whether you're
Yeah.
concerned about his apparent lack of knowledge about some pretty core things.
Yeah, that was so overall, I think my biggest takeaway was that the Democratic Party, the Democratic senators still do not seem to fully understand the average RFK supporter, just in general. I think
Yep.
that came through very clearly because they were speaking to the people who already do not support him. And they are certainly not going to win back any of the Democrats who went with him and left the party during the last
Yep.
election cycle. So
Yep.
I thought that was my biggest takeaway. I thought Ron Johnson's framing was actually really fascinating and really good. He's been really active in the MAHA movement. His framing of putting aside differences to come together around a bigger issue. It was fascinating to me to see a room with a nominee who is a lifelong Democrat being attacked by the Democrats and largely supported by the Republicans, with the exception of Senator Cassidy, someone who during the hearing was openly pro-choice, openly saying that he believes that climate change is an existential threat. And yet here he is as a nominee of President Trump, putting aside those things to work for some greater goal. I think the average voter right now is wanting to see more of that than seeing what we saw from all the W's, right? So Senator Wyden, Senator Warren, Senator Whitehouse, just sort of Senator Whitehouse said, I have 5 minutes, so you just have to listen. And then basically said all things that RFK would support while yelling at him. And that, as an average RFK supporter, I'm just like, what are you mad at right now? Everything you just said are things that he's supporting. I think the two areas, if I were going to, I agree with Brian that Senator Bennett, if you're from the Democratic perspective, was the most effective. And I think he was the most effective because he acknowledged the reality of the problem in the first part of his answer, right? He said, the reality is we are failing. Our healthcare system is failing us. We are getting sicker. And I think acknowledging that actually does help and go a long way to at least setting the stage. I thought Senator Welch did that as well, the junior senator from Vermont. The people who just sort of grandstand, Senator Warnock literally saying, I have the transcript of you saying that the CDC is like a Nazi death camp. Then reading the transcript, which did not include that, is sort of like, what are we doing here? If you're going to bring receipts that are real. And I think the average Kennedy supporter is more informed than the average Democratic senator thinks that they are, if that makes sense.
It does. Dr. John, first two questions, and then I will turn it over to the guys. Number one, are you saying there's 7 Democrats on the Finance Committee whose last names start with W?
The number of W Democratic senators blew my mind. They were almost all W.
It seems at least 6.
There actually was one
7.
that I missed.
If you were on the Health Committee as a senator tomorrow, what 2 questions would you ask Bobby Kennedy?
Well, if I was going to say, if I were advising Bobby Kennedy, which I am not.
No. If you were a senator from Tennessee and you had your 5 minutes, what would you ask him? I
would ask him, because of his known inexperience, like you were saying, with administrating an organization the size of HHS, particularly on the side of CMS, what is his plan to get guidance on how to do that? If I were Bobby Kennedy, I would have talked up people like Marty Makary, people like Jay Bhattacharya, who are very popular. The problem is Dr. Oz hasn't really run anything either. And that's not probably the best person to be talking up when you are also inexperienced on running an organization the size of CMS. Dr. Oz came out in 2020 and said he supports universal healthcare. So it's another one where these like reversals just really don't make a ton of sense. On the other hand, if I were advising Bobby Kennedy on the abortion question, to me, I don't want to get into the details of the issue of abortion, obviously, right now, but I thought he could have really turned it around in a much more effective way if he turned the bodily autonomy question back on Senator Hassan, for example, and said forced vaccine mandates when it comes to the COVID vaccine in young children and young men in particular was a pretty clear violation of bodily autonomy. And that would have been more effective than saying, oh, yeah, like I think all abortions are a tragedy, which is sort of the middle ground. I think he could have owned that a little bit more and said, yes, that was my position when I went to New Hampshire, and I still believe that, but I'm putting that aside because of this broader goal of, like J.D. Vance did in the debate, and expanding pro-life to mean making children healthy after they are born and throughout their life. So I think he could have been more effective on that question. But I still think overall, like everyone said, this is an expected sort of outcome, that this will largely be a partisan vote, and we'll see what Senator Cassidy decides.
Right. All right, Dan, welcome in. Tell folks where you are who don't know what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm in Alabama, North Alabama. I wanted to weigh in a little bit on this COVID thing because it has been quite the experience for the past 5 years. There people that are acting like this was a good thing still, I just don't think are informed. Because if you go and look at openvaers.com, where it takes the VAERS data and plots it on a thing, if you look at what happened in 2020 and 2021, it's unbelievable. The chart goes off the scale, and that's measuring every vaccine. So clearly we were lied to. And, I kind of knew about it right at the very beginning because of the masks thing. I knew that couldn't be possibly right the way that they were doing it. And it just seemed like there were so many stupid things going on at the time. And Trump seemed like he was trying to walk it back around June of that year. He was saying, oh, we'll be open by July the 4th, I think it was. And he got a lot of pushback on that. And they should have, because DeSantis opened up, Kemp opened up, and things went well. So those were
Dan,
those were
just go back to your first point. What's your question about the data?
Well, how can it, when I saw it, I thought to myself, when you introduce a new vaccine and there's that big of a jump in adverse reactions, it's up to you to prove it didn't cause it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, they were asking, well, prove that it did cause it. I'm saying, no, you prove it doesn't. It's not causing it. Yep. And this Dr. Joseph Freeman and colleagues from down in Louisiana that reanalyzed the data from the original trial, and the original trial shows that 1 in 800 people are going to be severely adversely affected by the vaccine. I mean, are we?
Dan, hold on, Dan. John, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. There's the New York Times, of all places, the failing New York Times, according to Donald Trump, came out with an article not so long ago that showed when vaccine hesitancy started to go down. And it was around 2019, 2020. So well before RFK came to a more national prominence. Yes, he had been in this space for a while, but he was certainly not as well known as he came to be later on. So that really started well before RFK. So all the people that are now coming on and saying, well, RFK is either already causing or will cause this decline in people wanting to vaccinate their children, that was already happening. So I think we do need to at least have the conversation of why that is. To me, as Dan's pointing out, a lot of people that I know that came around COVID, right? So as he said, we've talked about this before. We had the whole diner episode on it, so we don't want to rehash it. But for the Democrats not to acknowledge a lot of the things during COVID, well-intentioned or not, that either were not true or were certainly not true in the way that they said, is not helping them right now. And I think blaming RFK for something that was happening before he came into the national scene really misses the point.
Dan, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Crystal, tell folks who don't know where you are what's on your mind, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm from Belton, Texas, Central Texas.
Yes, ma'am.
I watched most of the hearing, and do the Democrats not care that most like mothers care about what is going into our children. And like I just was some of the responses to like just or the questions they were asking, I'm just like, there's a lot of women out here who are on the side of Robert F. Kennedy and want him to succeed, at
Yeah.
least to get him into that position.
Yeah. So Brian, let me see if I can frame up what Crystal said a little bit. Cory Booker is one of the very few prominent Democrats who have said with enthusiasm, this is really important. Bobby Kennedy is really spotlighting an important thing. Michael Bennet kind of said it today, but as has been pointed out, he said it in a pretty hostile way. It's the right thing. There's not a Democrat in the party who doesn't believe what Bobby Kennedy is talking about and who should be grateful to him for promoting it. Why wouldn't more Democrat and just on the politics of it, there's an army, not only women, but a lot of women, a lot of moms. It's an army of moms out there who want to be behind politicians who say stop the madness. Big ag, big pharma, a failure to take care of our kids. Why isn't there someone in the Democratic Party saying, guys, guys and gals, whatever else we're say about Bobby Kennedy, we should be celebrating this and appealing to these people, maybe with better ideas about how to be the party of Maha.
Are you really referring though, Mark, to just sort of the anti-vaccination movement?
Not anti, just talk about food.
The
Just
food.
just
Yeah.
just unhealthy food. We have moms come on here all the
Oh,
time.
absolutely. I think there was across the board, and I agree with Crystal. I think there was across the board agreement, in that area, but it was one of the few areas of agreement in that hearing.
But Brian, let me just stop you for a second. I'm sorry to interrupt. Separate from the hearing, ever since Bobby Kennedy,
Yep.
like in 1992, when Ross Perot was getting huge traction with the deficit, both George Bush and Bill Clinton started talking about the deficit because it was clear. The Republican Party failed to figure out what Donald Trump was doing on immigration. They failed to figure out what he was doing on trade, right? And this one's in their wheelhouse. There's not a person in the party who doesn't agree with Bobby Kennedy. So forget the hearing.
Yep.
Why for the last 9 months since he's been prominent, a year really, why hasn't the Democratic Party said, we're going to own this issue?
Well, I think that there's so many other areas of his positions, though, Mark, that are questionable. So I think that they're holding that to be true, while trying to agree largely with this area. I think you'll see some of that area of agreement tomorrow, by the way, in a committee that's much more positioned to talk about those issues. So I think they're going to agree with him there. But I still don't think, the purpose of a hearing is to really be able to talk about the differences. And I think that that's what they were trying to illuminate. But I think that he's brought up some legitimate issues with regard to the health of our country that we can't ignore. And it's pretty powerful. I have to say, but just as I mentioned before, when you talk about all of the other things that are ahead of that, when we think about Medicare, Medicaid, the future of those, COVID, you talk about other vaccinations, Lyme disease, pesticides, AIDS. I mean, there's just too many other things that bump up against that. So I think the hearing was meaningful in that sense, and I don't think you can ignore it because I think that's what they brought up today.
Yeah, Crystal, thank you. Very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Matt, and before we bring Tom in, I've been impressed, just as I've been confounded by the Democrats not trying to take back this issue. I've been impressed by, I hear Republican senators I never would have thought would have been champions of, taking on big ag. I hear them doing it. So how do you explain the inverse of what I see in the Democrats? How do you explain how the Republicans have gotten on board with a liberal Democrat Kennedy being a champion of a movement that they're part of now?
I think it's a natural distrust you're seeing in the party of big corporations. Certainly, we always have had it of government, but it's big corporations too. And this is the hallmark of the last 10, 15 years. And look, if Susan Collins votes for RFK Jr., which is not out of the cards yet, I believe,
I agree.
she's going to use this kind of processed food argument to endear herself to the crunchy granolas folks outside of Portland, who are she's gonna need their margins in
Yeah.
2026. I guarantee.
Less mayo in the shrimp salad for the kids.
Yep.
I mean, the lobster salad. Tom, welcome in. Thank you for joining. Great shirt. Tell folks where you are, what's on your mind, please.
I'm in Florida, and I'm a retired neurosurgeon. So you might understand why I don't particularly like plaintiff lawyers. And I had a hard time understanding RFK until I really came to grips with the fact that he's a plaintiff lawyer. He's able to swing things his way to make a point with only a little bit of attempt to make it an understandable argument. And I listened to a little bit of the this afternoon, and I just had to turn it off because he has no foundation in reality. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but he manages to make it seem like he does. So my question to particularly Dr. John is, how do you square the fact that he is able to do that and say things that he doesn't believe, doesn't understand, doesn't really have any knowledge about, and yet he is a spokesman for basically the medical establishment?
Yeah. Tom, before John answers, just could you give one or two examples of something you heard him say that you think reflects that your view that he doesn't know what he's talking about?
No, I didn't listen long enough.
Okay, but you just think in general he's ignorant about science?
Yes.
Okay, John.
Yeah, I'll briefly answer it in a few ways. So I think the opening question from Senator Wyden, when he started to try to get him on, the two things he tried to get him on was basically Senator Wyden trying to defend the COVID vaccine for 6-year-olds, which in this past year, only 11% of children got the COVID vaccine. So that's not probably a popular position, right? He does understand the science of COVID and the COVID vaccine better than pretty much every Democratic and Republican senator on that committee. I do believe that because I've listened to him on the 3-hour versions of pretty much every podcast that he's done compared to the 30 seconds that he was allowed to answer the questions today. He even brought up one of those podcasts Senator Wyden did, and RFK knew immediately. He said, yeah, that's when I was on Lex Friedman, and he cut me off. And if I was going to answer fully, here's what I would have said. So I do push back on the merits of.
So you're saying, in your experience, Bobby Kennedy understands the science and research around the impact of COVID vaccines on kids. That's what you're saying, right?
On kids and young adults and the COVID vaccine in general.
Okay.
Now,
Tom,
I do want to say to Tom really quick. My support for RFK had nothing to do with vaccines. It came in from the other side of being, I'm not retired. I still work every day in the hospital. I've worked with chronic pain patients. I've seen our system, and I believe it to be failing patients. I think our system is broken and it is not working. I have seen it in my own kids. I am desperate to not have them harmed by our food system. I see the top 4 people from 1990 to 2024 that receive pharmaceutical funding. They're all 4 Democrats. They've been in control for 12 of the last 16 years. I voted for a Democratic president every single year until this one. I do not have any vested party interest. I think our healthcare system is failing, and he's the first candidate that came out to me and unequivocally stated it. Yes, I do think corporate control and capture of our regulatory bodies is one of the fundamental issues in our republic. And he's the only candidate that I heard talk about it. And so, yes, that's what drew me to him. It was my experience of healthcare with my patients, and then going back and studying what he said. It doesn't mean I agree with everything he said, but I think he is right in the sense that our country overall, the future for my kids seems to be worse than the future that I am living in right now, which was worse than the 90s when I was growing up, and the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. And I don't want my kids to grow up in a more unhealthy future And that's why I supported what he is
Tom,
trying to do.
Tom, we're right up against the end, but I'd love for you to respond to what John said.
Well, I agree that our healthcare system is in trouble. I think it's poor and getting worse, and I would agree with that. I don't think that a plaintiff lawyer who has never run a large institution is the person to take over an organization like that. And quickly, as to vaccines, everybody is vaccinated almost, and we have had such success in treating chronic or acute diseases with vaccines over the last few centuries that to put any kind of fear of vaccines in the minds of our people, I think is bad.
I agree. I agree with you in general about vaccines, but we rush through these vaccines, and there's lots of data and lots of anecdotal that maybe kids shouldn't have gotten them. And I don't think we should be afraid of having that conversation. And I don't think we should call people who want to have the conversation nuts or conspiracy theorists, even though Bobby Kennedy is arguably both those things. I don't think that should intimidate us or inhibit us from having the conversation.
I still don't think that one out of 10, by the way, issues that he addressed in the hearing where he was wrong in 9/10 of those issues, and you're talking about one of
Yeah.
those. And
Why isn't that one?
I agree with John that yes, the health of our children and the questionable aspect of children's vaccination or COVID vaccination is absolutely something that should be a light should shine on that. But that is all the other things that were talked about there should not be ignored.
Totally agree with you, Brian. And that's part of why Bobby Kennedy is so vexing. When he's at his best, I really do think he's a singular voice in America. There's no one who's shined the light the way he has. But there's so many ways to argue. Leave his personal life aside, just based on his record, his public statements, his lack of experience. The notion that he's the most qualified to run this department, I think, is silly on the face of it. But he is the president's choice, and increasingly, people I talk to thinks he will be confirmed. But just like with Hegseth, we learned this morning, Hegseth was one senator being bullied away from not being confirmed. And I think Kennedy may well be on the same knife's edge. Both doctors, thank you so much for joining. We'd love having you. I'd love you to come back. Brian and Matt also, thank you both. Very grateful to all of you for participating. And for those others, Dan and others who asked questions. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time, Sean, Dan, and I will be back. And we'll have some special programming to tell you about for early next week. But otherwise, 9 a.m. and then 6 p.m. tomorrow night. Grateful to all of you for being part of this. Thank you, Matt and Brian especially, and have a great night. We'll see you at 9 a.m. tomorrow.